A woman can be invisible inside her own home. She can wake up before the sun, work until after midnight, carry the weight of an entire family on her shoulders, and still, to the people who should love her, not exist. Josephine lived like a servant inside her own home, oppressed by her father and sister, promised in marriage to a man she feared. Weston was the richest man in Coldwater Valley, owner of Golden Ridge Ranch, surrounded by responsibilities he had never chosen. But a chance meeting by the edge of a creek, a blue ribbon forgotten on a rock, was about to change everything. Josephine Hartwell was 26 years old. Her red hair was always tied back, because loose hair was a luxury for those who had time, and she did not. Her eyes were a deep blue that impressed anyone who took the time to truly look at her. But inside that big house, no one made that effort. Everyone pretended not to see her, because it was more convenient that way. She woke up before sunrise every day, without rest. While the rest of the family slept between soft sheets, Josephine was already on her feet, lighting the stove, heating the water, sweeping the cold hallways of the house that had once been the pride of the Hartwell family. Since her father had dismissed the stable caretaker to cut expenses, she also took care of the horses. The work never ended, and the day never seemed long enough for everything they demanded of her. She did not live in that house. She served in that house, and the difference between those two things weighed on her every day like a stone on her chest. The Hartwell property had once been one of the largest cattle ranches in the valley, with corrals stretching as far as the eye could see, and a name that opened doors in every town in the region. But that was before Ezra Hartwell's debts began swallowing everything. At 64 years old, with a lifetime of bad choices at the poker tables in the saloon, Ezra was the kind of man who blamed the world for his own mistakes and never found the courage within himself to change. Debt collectors knocked on the door with increasing frequency, and while he tried to keep up appearances before the neighbors, it was Josephine who kept the household running with her own hands, receiving nothing in return except orders and contempt. She cooked, washed, mended clothes, milked the cows before dawn, and still found time to calm the horses whenever a storm darkened the valley sky without warning. There was a reason Ezra treated her that way, a reason he never had the courage to put into words. Josephine was the daughter from his first marriage, to a woman he had never truly loved. On the day of her mother's funeral, before the earth had even covered the coffin, he called her aside. "Josephine," Ezra said, without looking into her eyes. "Starting today, you're going to move your belongings into the little room at the back, near the kitchen. You'll work to pay for the expenses you bring upon this family. It's more than fair." And he walked away without another word. Josephine stood beside the grave, alone, her chest empty in a way she had never felt before. That day, she lost her mother and her father at the same time. Loretta, Ezra's youngest daughter, was 23 years old and Josephine's half-sister. She was not born a bad person, but she was raised spoiled by her father, protected from every hardship, taught from an early age to see herself as superior to her older sister. Over time, that seed found fertile ground and grew in a way that could no longer be undone. She treated Josephine like a servant, without the slightest hesitation, ordering her around, making demands, humiliating her whenever the opportunity arose, and she did it with a naturalness that showed how deeply it had become a part of her. Ezra pretended not to notice, just as he pretended not to notice many things when it came to his eldest daughter, who seemed to have ceased to exist for them, erased even while she was there, present every day, carrying the weight of an entire household on her shoulders. But there was one exception within those walls: Mrs. Adeline Combs, an elderly woman with white hair and hands made rough by years of hard work, who had served in the Hartwell household for more years than she liked to count. While the other servants kept their distance from Josephine for fear of displeasing Ezra or Loretta, Mrs. Adeline never cared about that. One night, when Josephine returned late with her hands injured from cleaning the fence posts, the elderly woman was waiting for her with a basin of warm water and a bottle of tincture. "You didn't have to wait for me," Josephine said as she sat down. "I know I didn't," Mrs. Adeline replied, carefully cleaning the cuts. But you wouldn't be able to do this by yourself. Why do you still stand by my side? Josephine asked softly. Because alone and forgotten is exactly what they want you to be, the elderly woman said, her voice filled with tenderness. And I refuse to help them with that. Josephine kept those words in her heart, in the same place where she kept everything she could not say out loud. The years passed that way, one day just like the next, and she learned not to expect anything from anyone within those walls. A wave of excitement began to spread through Coldwater Valley. News circulated that Weston Calloway, the richest rancher in the region, owner of Golden Ridge Ranch, would soon choose a bride from among the young women of the valley's families. Ezra heard that and felt the urge to gamble everything on a single hand. He took on more debt, bought expensive dresses and jewelry for Loretta, and when the invitations to the ball arrived, he looked Josephine up and down with his usual cold stare. "This invitation is not for you," Ezra said. "Loretta will represent this family. You have nothing to offer in a place like that, Josephine." Josephine did not answer. The night of the ball was long. She spent it cleaning the empty rooms, imagining a ballroom filled with music and light. She did not want wealth. She did not want anything Loretta wanted. She only wanted to be seen, to be included, to be treated as part of the family that neglected her. Later, it was Mrs. Adeline who came into the kitchen carrying a plate of food and sat beside her in silence. "You deserve so much more than this," the elderly woman said, before getting up and leaving. The next day, Loretta returned radiant, talking about the dresses, the brightly lit halls, and about Weston, the most imposing man in the ballroom. Josephine listened to everything without saying a word. In the days that followed, as Weston visited the families of the valley, Josephine's exhaustion only increased, and she found less and less time to escape to the creek, the only place where no one ordered her around. But one day, while her father and sister had gone into town, she managed to go. Dear listeners of Boundless Ranch Love, before we find out where Josephine went, tell me here in the comments, what do you usually do when your heart aches more than you can bear? I have 3 incredible people with whom I share whatever becomes too heavy, and many times I share it through the stories I write. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Today's story brings a beautiful reflection. Now come with me. Let's discover where Josephine is. Coldwater Creek crossed the valley behind the Hartwell lands with a calmness that seemed intentional. The water was crystal clear, flowing unhurriedly over the smooth stones, making a constant gentle sound that Josephine thought was the most beautiful she had ever heard. In the middle of the creek stood a large, smooth rock. Josephine took off her boots, untied her hair, climbed onto the rock, lay on her back, and closed her eyes. The sun bathed her face. The cold water surrounded her feet. She took a deep breath and, for a few minutes, was free, imagining what it would be like to ride far away from there and never have to return. Then she heard the sound of hoofbeats, the neigh of a horse, growing closer, more real. She turned her head, slowly opened her eyes, and looked toward the opposite bank. And that was when she saw him for the first time. Standing beside a dark horse, his hat pushed back on his head, tall, broad-shouldered, light hair tousled by the wind. His green eyes were fixed on her, mixing surprise with a fascination he had never expected to feel there. Josephine sat up with a start, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. He raised a hand in a calm gesture. "I'm sorry, miss. I didn't mean to frighten you," he said. "It's all right," Josephine replied, her voice coming out steadier than she had expected, but it wasn't. She climbed down from the rock, picked up her boots, and crossed the field as fast as her legs would allow, without looking back. She did not know who that man was, but one thing was clear. She would never be able to forget those green eyes. On the other side of the creek, Weston Calloway stood still with the reins in his hand, watching the woman climb the bank with her red hair blowing in the wind. He would never forget that face. He crossed the creek without caring that his boots got wet, and, on the bank where she had been standing, he saw a thin, worn blue velvet ribbon lying on the ground. The same color as her eyes, he thought. He slipped the ribbon into his coat pocket. One of his men arrived, calling for them to continue on their way, and Weston mounted his horse, but before leaving he looked one last time at the empty rock and made a silent promise. He would find that woman again, and he would return the ribbon. "Josephine, where are you?" The shout came from the living room. It was Loretta's voice, cutting through the hallway like a blade. Loretta stood there with her hat still on her head, her face full of irritation. Ezra came in right behind her, unconcerned with anything. "Where were you?" Loretta asked. "In the stable. The horses were restless," Josephine replied. "I came home and nothing was ready," Loretta said, taking a step toward her. "You must always be available. That's what you're here for." Ezra walked past them without saying a word, without even looking at Josephine. She remained standing there, knowing that wasting energy on Loretta was like arguing with a rock. "It won't happen again," she said quietly. Loretta threw her gloves onto the table and walked away. Josephine went into the kitchen and, instinctively slipping her hand into the pocket of her apron, realized it was empty. "The ribbon," she whispered. "I dropped it on the riverbank." Mrs. Adeline, who was stirring a pot, understood immediately. She knew what that ribbon represented, carried close to Josephine's body for years as a way of keeping her mother near. "Tomorrow you'll go back there and get it," she said firmly. "What if it's no longer there?" "Then you'll learn to carry your mother in another way," Mrs. Adeline replied, placing her hand over Josephine's chest. "She's in you. She always has been." Over the following days, Weston returned to the creek. Not once, not twice. He returned more times than he could count, always taking the same dirt road that crossed the valley, always dismounting on the same bank, always stopping for a few minutes before the empty rock. The creek flowed with the same familiar sound. The birds sang all around, and she never appeared. Weston was not a man accustomed to waiting. The life he led left no room for it. There were pastures to manage, foremen to listen to, decisions that could not be postponed. Golden Ridge Ranch was a responsibility he had not chosen, but he carried it with the seriousness of a man who understood the weight of what had been entrusted to him. There, for a few minutes, that burden disappeared, and he left with something different in his heart. The ribbon remained in his coat pocket, and every morning his fingers found the worn velvet almost on their own, such a small gesture that he barely noticed it. But it was there, and as long as it remained there, he would not give up. As time passed, the ranch's responsibilities demanded more of him, and his visits to the creek became less frequent. He needed to choose a wife. That was what his position required, even if it rarely matched what he truly wanted. During his visits to the families of the region, his eyes searched every face, hoping to find the red hair that never left his thoughts. He never found it. Josephine never forgot either. 8 months passed, and she still felt those green eyes upon her. She went to the creek many times hoping to meet him again, but he never appeared. Then Ezra received a message from Golden Ridge Ranch, informing him that Weston would visit the property to get to know Loretta. It was an exhausting week of cleaning. On the day of the visit, Ezra called Josephine aside. "You'll stay in your room. Don't come into the living room," he said, without looking at her. Josephine spent the evening listening to muffled voices through the closed door. The next day, Loretta entered the kitchen radiant. "I'm almost certain I'll be engaged soon," she said, sitting at the table as though it were a grand ballroom. "I'll finally have the life I deserve." Without raising her eyes, Josephine asked whether she did not mind marrying without love. "Love doesn't matter to me," Loretta replied with a laugh. "When a man is handsome and rich, love is a dispensable detail." Josephine thought the opposite. She longed for a marriage based on love, for a man who would truly see her. And once again, the image of the man by the creek came into her mind. It was that same week that Cyrus Bell appeared without warning on a bright afternoon. He was a 55-year-old man who had made his fortune buying debts and charging heavy interest. Josephine was called to bring coffee into the office and felt his gaze on her, slow and shameless, looking her over without the slightest restraint. The discomfort clung to her skin for the rest of the day. "Something is wrong," Josephine said quietly that night, while Mrs. Adeline tended to her hand. She was not mistaken. The next day, during lunch, Ezra folded his hands on the table. "I've made an agreement with Cyrus Bell," he said, with the same coldness as always. "You'll marry him soon. In return, he'll pay off the family's debts." It was as if the ground disappeared beneath Josephine's feet. She stood motionless, staring at her father, waiting for it not to be real, waiting for him to keep talking and say that he had spoken incorrectly. But Ezra did not continue. He kept looking at the table, just as he always did when he did not want to face what he was doing. Loretta clapped her hands. "Be happy, sister," she said. "He's older and ugly, but he's rich. That's already more than you deserve." Josephine did not cry in front of them. She nodded, turned her back, and ran across the field to the creek. She climbed onto the rock, hugged her knees, and there she let the tears come. It was not only sadness, it was the pain of realizing that her father would never change, that he was taking away the only hope she still held on to, the chance to be truly loved by someone she herself chose. She did not know how long she remained there. The sun was still high when she heard a sound on the riverbank. She quickly wiped the tears from her eyes, not wanting anyone to see her in that state. She stood up from the rock and was turning to leave when she heard a voice asking her to wait. She recognized the voice even before she turned completely around. It was a voice she had not heard for 8 months, but had never forgotten. As she turned, she stumbled without realizing he was standing right behind her, and her hands landed on the chest of the man before her, who caught her by the waist. Her blue eyes met the green ones fixed on her. At that moment, time seemed to have forgotten to move. There were only the two of them, and the sound of 2 hearts beating fast as they found each other again. The song of a bird in the distance broke the silence, and the two stepped apart. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you again," Weston said. "It's all right," she replied, her voice still trembling. "Wait. I need to give you something." He took the blue velvet ribbon out of his pocket. Josephine stared at it, unable to speak. "You kept it all this time," she said softly. "I never lost hope that I would see you again so I could return it," he replied. She carefully took the ribbon, bringing it close to her chest. "It was a gift from my mother. It's all I have left of her." "Are you all right?" Weston asked, genuine concern in his voice. She tried to say yes, but the tears would not obey. He handed her a handkerchief without saying a word, and she returned to the rock, sitting down with her knees drawn up. He sat beside her. "I like coming here when responsibilities become too heavy," Weston said. "What brought you here today, sir?" "Some difficult decisions I don't agree with." "I wish I could make decisions," Josephine said, looking at the ribbon between her fingers. "Mine have already been made in my name." "I'm sorry for that," he said, without the casualness of someone saying it just for the sake of saying it. "So am I," she replied, with a sigh that carried years of exhaustion. When she said she had to leave, he stood up as well. "May I walk you back?" "That wouldn't be wise. I'm promised in marriage. If my father saw me in the company of another man, he wouldn't approve." There was sadness in Josephine's voice. Weston felt a pain he had not expected. He realized that if he had ever had a chance to be with the woman from the creek, he had just lost it. She left, climbing the bank with the ribbon clenched tightly in her hand, unaware that she was leaving behind a heart that was breaking. Weston stood there for a long time. He didn't know her name. Perhaps it was better that way. But as he mounted his horse, one thing became clear. His deadline had run out. He needed to choose someone. Back at the ranch house, he looked over the photographs of the young women once more, but none of them made his heart beat the way the woman from the creek did. Even so, he wrote a note. His intended bride would be Ezra Hartwell's daughter. The day to formalize his engagement to Loretta drew closer, and he felt increasingly unhappy, a burden present in every joyless morning. At the Hartwell house, Loretta behaved as though the wedding were only days away, practicing in front of the mirror the tone she would use to give orders, and putting it into practice with Josephine. "Do it again," Loretta said, looking at the hallway that had just been cleaned. "When I'm married to Weston, I'll have servants more competent than you." Josephine swallowed her feelings and started over in silence. Ezra ordered her to scrub even the stones in the wall, polish the silverware, and she was not allowed to appear during Weston's visits. With her exhaustion building, Josephine even began to consider that marrying Cyrus Bell might not be so terrible. At least it would get her out of there. On the day of the dinner to formalize the engagement, Ezra called her into the hallway. "You'll stay in the kitchen tonight," he said, without looking at her. After dinner, Mrs. Adeline hurried into the kitchen. "Ezra asked you to serve the wine in the sitting room." Josephine arranged the tray and headed toward the room, telling herself it would be quick. She pushed the door open and walked in. The first detail she noticed was the man sitting with his back to her beside Loretta. The color of his hair, his broad shoulders, the posture she recognized from an afternoon by the creek. Her heart raced before she was even certain. She began serving the glasses with hands that were no longer completely steady. Neither of them looked at her as she served. She was part of the furniture. When she turned to carry the tray away, she found the same pair of green eyes looking directly at her. Time stopped. Weston stood completely still. The blue eyes, the tied-back red hair, the servant's apron. It was her. After 8 months searching every property he visited, every face he observed, the woman from the creek was standing just 2 steps away, holding a tray, inside the Hartwell house. Josephine tried to hold on, tried to keep her balance, tried to breathe. But the tray slipped from her hands and crashed to the floor, the wine spilling across the wooden floorboards and splashing onto Loretta's silk dress. Loretta's scream echoed through the room. The first movement that no one expected was Weston's, who knelt down and began gathering the broken pieces. "Josephine, kitchen, now," Loretta said, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. Josephine left the room with her head lowered, her steps quick, her face burning. Weston picked up the tray, carefully placed the glasses on it, and stood up. He looked at Ezra, who did not know where to look, and walked toward the kitchen without saying a word. Josephine was already backed against the sink when he arrived. Loretta stood in front of her, her voice sharp, the words coming one after another. The other servants stood back in the corners, motionless. Mrs. Adeline stood near the stove with her fists clenched at her sides, holding back an anger that grew with every word. "Incompetent," Loretta said. "This is your place, Josephine. Our father is ashamed to introduce you as his daughter. I pity Cyrus Bell for agreeing to marry you just to pay off the debts." Every word landed with the weight of someone who knew exactly where it hurt. Then Weston placed the tray on the table with a sharp thud that cut Loretta off in the middle of a sentence. "Loretta," he said in a voice that needed no volume. "Wait in the sitting room." She left, her steps far less confident. Weston turned to Josephine, gently took her injured hand in his with a care she had not expected. "Are you all right?" he asked. The tears she had been holding back ran down her face. "You didn't have to do that," she said, without looking at him. "It's all right, I don't mind," Weston replied. "But you should. I don't want to be the reason for trouble for you." "Josephine," he said, and the way he pronounced her name for the first time made her lift her eyes. "Nothing that happened tonight was your fault. He released her hand with the same care and headed toward the sitting room, passing Ezra in the hallway. He asked him to come to the office. It was not an invitation. The three of them gathered there, the door firmly closed. "Ezra," Weston said, "how did you reach the point of giving away your own daughter to pay off debts, to a man like Cyrus Bell?" "These are family matters. You have no way of understanding," Ezra replied. "I understand perfectly. You found a bargaining chip in your own daughter. What I cannot understand is how a father looks at his daughter and does not see a person. He sees only a solution." Weston turned to Loretta. "What I saw in that kitchen tonight was someone humiliating her own sister in front of everyone, as though it were normal. I am withdrawing the engagement." Loretta fell to her knees. "Please, it was a moment of anger. I'm not really like that." "Stand up, Miss Loretta," he said, without harshness, but without giving any opening. "What I saw was a character that reveals itself when a person believes no one is watching. I was." Weston walked toward the kitchen, but Josephine was no longer there. He found Mrs. Adeline near the window. "I need you to give her a message," he said quietly. "Tell her I want to meet her in 2 days, at dusk, in the place where she feels at peace. Josephine knows where that is." Mrs. Adeline nodded. "I'll tell her." Josephine was sitting on the back steps in the dark, the ribbon clutched tightly in her hand. She was no longer crying, only feeling the exhaustion and the dull pain she already knew so well. But something different was mixed in with it. One man had seen everything, and instead of looking away, had held her hand. Mrs. Adeline sat beside her, tended to her injured hand, and only then spoke. "Weston left a message. He wants you to meet him in 2 days, at dusk, in the place where you feel at peace." Josephine remained silent. The simple man by the creek, who had kept the ribbon for 8 months, was the richest rancher in the region. She told Mrs. Adeline everything: the day by the creek, her racing heart, the hope of seeing him again. Mrs. Adeline listened to everything with tears in her eyes and squeezed her hand. "If he kept the ribbon for 8 months and returned to the creek looking for you, then he is a man worthy of your trust." That night, at the ranch house, Weston did not sleep, thinking about Josephine's expression, about the dignity that no humiliation had managed to erase. He wrote a note to Cyrus Bell, requesting his presence to discuss business, and the next day, he bought Ezra's debts for an amount far greater than they were worth. He did not care. To get Josephine out of that situation, he would pay whatever was necessary. Meanwhile, at the Hartwell house, Josephine was paying a heavy price for what had happened. Loretta blamed her for the canceled engagement. Ezra, once again revealing the kind of man he truly was, sent her to the little room at the back and bolted the door from the outside, saying she would remain there until he decided what to do with her. The sound of the bolt sliding into place hurt in a way she had not expected. It was not only being locked up, it was being treated like a problem to be put away. From the window, she looked out over the fields, toward the place where the creek must still be flowing, thinking about Weston waiting on the bank while the sun went down and she never appeared. The only person who entered the room was Mrs. Adeline, bringing food and water. On the second night, the elderly woman remained seated longer than usual and said she had noticed the way Weston looked at Josephine, that it was not the look of an indifferent man. On the agreed day, when Josephine did not appear at the creek, Weston waited until the light faded, becoming increasingly certain that something was wrong. He could not appear at the Hartwell house without a valid reason. He would have to wait. It was Mrs. Adeline who resolved the situation. On the morning of the 3rd day, she woke before sunrise, as she had done every morning for more years than she herself could remember. But this time, she did not go to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. She put on the wool coat she wore on the coldest days, fastened the buttons tightly, and slipped out through the back door before anyone woke up. She no longer cared what might happen to her. What mattered was Josephine. She had carried that burden for years, remained silent for years, caring for and protecting her whenever she could, and even when she could not. But seeing Josephine locked in that room was too much. It had to end. She walked across the fields while the sun was still low, the dew soaking her boots, the cold morning wind striking her face until she reached the gate of Golden Ridge Ranch, her feet aching and her back tired. Escorted to Weston's office, she sat down only after he gestured for her to do so. "Ma'am, did you walk all the way here?" he asked, rising to his feet. "I did. I had to come," she replied. "It's about Josephine," Weston said. It was not a question, and the elderly woman told him everything. Josephine had been locked in the little room at the back since the night of the dinner. She also revealed the truth she had carried for years. Those lands did not belong to Ezra. They belonged to Josephine's mother, and Ezra had forged the deed, putting his own name and Loretta's where Josephine's name should have been. Weston listened without interrupting. Then he stood up. "You don't need to return to that house. I want you to stay here. I'll go bring Josephine back." "Thank you," Mrs. Adeline said, tears filling her eyes. "Not for me, for her." Weston arrived at the Hartwell property early that afternoon. Loretta greeted him at the entrance with her usual calculated smile, believing he had returned to restore the engagement. "Mr. Weston, what an honor to welcome you back," she said. Ezra appeared right behind her. "It is an honor." Weston did not stop walking. "Where is Josephine?" "Josephine?" Loretta repeated, surprised. "She's just a servant in the house. You don't need to concern yourself with her." Weston stopped and looked directly at her. "Josephine is not a servant. She is the one and only rightful owner of these lands, and the only reason you have a roof over your heads." "How dare you?" Ezra said. "Josephine is my daughter, and she is here under my responsibility." "Responsibility, Ezra? Is that what you call locking your daughter in a room as though she were a burden?" Weston handed him the papers. "The debts have been paid, and the deed to these lands will be restored to the name of the one to whom they have always rightfully belonged. You have until the end of the day to leave Josephine's property." "But she is our family," Ezra began. "You stopped knowing what a family is a long time ago. Where is she?" Ezra merely pointed toward the back of the house. Weston headed that way without looking back, his heart beating harder than he cared to admit. Standing before the door with the bolt fastened, he paused for a moment, then opened it with a steady hand. The room was smaller than he had imagined. Josephine was standing with her back to him, looking out the window. "Mrs. Adeline, you can leave it on the little table. I'll eat later," she said, without turning around. "Josephine," Weston said. She turned at the sound of his voice. Her blue eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. During the days she had been locked in the room, Josephine had begun to believe, in her darkest moments, that she would never see Weston again, that what had happened on the night of the dinner would be the end of everything. And there he was, standing in the doorway of the room where she had spent 3 days, having crossed the entire house just to reach her. "Weston." The word came out like a sigh filled with relief. He walked over to her and carefully handed her a document. "It's over, Josephine." It was the receipt showing that the debt to Cyrus Bell had been paid. Tears streamed down her face before she could stop them. "I have no words. I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't have to. I only did what was right," Weston replied. "But there's something you need to know. These lands are yours, Josephine. They always have been. Your father forged the deed. Mrs. Adeline told me. I ordered them to leave by the end of the day. Loretta and Ezra will never harm you again." Josephine looked out the window, at the fields that now belonged to her, tears silently running down her face. Weston spoke first, not with the voice of a rancher, but of a man who had finally found what he had been searching for. "From the day I saw you at the creek," he said, I knew that no other woman would ever find her way into my heart. I kept the ribbon because it was the only thing I had to remind me that that day had truly happened, that you were real. Josephine listened in silence, tears still falling. When you told me you were promised to another man, he continued, I felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I didn't know your name, but not for a single moment during those 8 months did I stop thinking about you. That day at the creek, when I walked away carrying my boots in my hands, Josephine said, I had only one certainty. If I had the right to make just one choice, I would choose you. Weston took a step toward her and raised his hand, with the care of someone who knows that what he is about to touch is precious. Josephine closed her eyes when his hand touched her face. It was not the touch of someone giving orders. It was the touch of someone who chooses. Marry me, Josephine, he said. From the day I first saw you, I have never been whole again, because the other half has always been with you. Josephine did not hesitate, and she said yes. Weston claimed her lips in a passionate kiss, 8 months of waiting for a love that seemed impossible, but was real. Ezra walked out through the front door at the end of that afternoon, carrying what he could in an old trunk, his shoulders bent, the closed expression of a man who had lost everything because of who he was, and because he had never had the honesty to change. He passed the servants who stood silently watching without saying a word. He looked at none of them. He did not look at the house. There was sadness in that silence, not the sadness of someone who had lost something that belonged to him, but of someone who looks back on his own life and sees the trail of what he caused with his own hands. Ezra never understood what he had lost by treating Josephine the way he had, and that lack of understanding was, of all his losses, the most final. Loretta left with red eyes and wounded pride, unable to fully understand how she had ended up there. There was anger inside her, but also, buried deep down, a small and unfamiliar shame that she might never admit out loud. And sometimes that is exactly how change begins. The property grew quiet after the two of them left. For the first time in a long while, that stillness held nothing oppressive. It was the silence of a place waiting for a new beginning. Josephine looked at the walls that had watched her wake before sunrise, swallowing tears no one ever saw. Now they belonged to her, and what she would do with them was a choice only she could make. The decision came clearly and firmly, that property would become a refuge, a place where women who had lost their footing could find a clean bed, a warm meal, and someone who looked at them as people, not as problems to be solved. Weston stood beside her through it all, not as someone making the decisions, but as someone simply standing by her side. Mrs. Adeline moved into the main house at Golden Ridge Ranch, received a room of her own, a wide bed, meals served at the proper times, and the rest she had never known while serving in a house where no effort was ever appreciated. During the first few days, she sat by the window of her new room, looking out over the ranch garden with an expression that anyone who did not know her might mistake for melancholy. But it was actually the face of someone trying to grow accustomed to being cared for after spending an entire lifetime caring for others. There were servants who came to ask whether she needed anything, who brought her coffee without her asking, who opened the windows every morning with a kindness she did not quite know how to receive. Mrs. Adeline slowly learned how to accept care. It was one of the hardest things she ever learned in her life, and one of the most beautiful. Josephine and Mrs. Adeline saw each other every day, sitting side by side, holding hands, without needing words. It was Josephine's way of saying thank you, and Mrs. Adeline's way of saying that every step of that long walk to the ranch gate had been worth it. Weston's mother came from the territorial capital for the wedding, an elegant woman who had spent her life knowing how to distinguish what was genuine from what merely appeared to be. She observed Josephine for a long moment before approaching her. "My son's heart chose very well," she said, looking directly into Josephine's eyes. "So did mine," Josephine replied with genuine simplicity. Weston's mother smiled sincerely for the first time. In that meeting, there was a silent, mutual recognition between them. The wedding took place in the ranch garden on an afternoon beneath a clear sky. It was not the kind of grand ceremony with hundreds of guests and extravagant decorations. It was a ceremony of real people, surrounded by the people who mattered, in a garden scented with the valley's wildflowers. Weston waited beneath the trees when Josephine appeared at the end of the garden, her loose red hair falling over her shoulders like a cascade of fire. The blue velvet ribbon fastened in it, exactly where it had always belonged. Her dress was simple and beautiful, without excess, without anything that was not truly her. He looked at her with the same green eyes as always, as though that moment were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. A silence settled over the guests, the kind that happens when something genuine appears in a world accustomed to rehearsed performances. No one needed to say anything. Everyone saw it. Mrs. Adeline, seated in the front row with a handkerchief in her hand, cried through the entire ceremony, tears of joy. Josephine walked up to Weston and stopped before him. There was no nervousness between them, only the same calmness as the creek. "Josephine," Weston said when it was time for the vows, his voice low, spoken only for her. "I searched for you in every face I saw for 8 months. I promised to spend the rest of my life being the man you deserve to have by your side." "Weston," she said, her voice steady and clear, her eyes filled with tears of happiness. "For years I learned not to expect anything from anyone. You taught me that being seen is not asking too much, that being chosen is not too great a dream. And I promise you that I will choose you every day of my life." The pastor spoke the customary words, and when it came time to say yes, they both answered at the same moment, without hesitation. The garden filled with the sound of joyful people. Months later, Weston bought the property through which the creek flowed and gave it to Josephine as a gift. It held no strategic value for the ranch, but it was the only place in the world where, for years, she had been able to be herself, and Weston knew that better than anyone. One afternoon at the creek, Josephine climbed onto the rock, with Weston right behind her. They sat side by side with their feet in the cold water, watching the valley glow golden beneath the late afternoon light. Weston gently placed his hands on Josephine's rounded belly, and the baby kicked once, firm and determined. Josephine placed her hand over Weston's and remained there, perfectly still, simply feeling. Within that simple gesture was a sense of completeness she had never known before. It was not the absence of problems, or the guarantee that nothing would ever go wrong again. It was something deeper than that, the certainty that, whatever happened, she would never be alone again. The blue ribbon was fastened in Josephine's hair, just as it had been on her wedding day, just as it had been on the day it was found on the riverbank by a pair of hands that kept it safe for 8 entire months. It shimmered in the late afternoon light with the same color as her eyes, the same color Weston had noticed on that very first day and had never forgotten. The baby kicked again, and the two of them laughed at the same time, there on the rock, their feet in the water and the entire valley surrounding them, needing nothing more than that. Dear listeners, we have reached the end of another story, and before we say goodbye, I need to share something with you. There is a lie that is sometimes told to us so many times that we eventually begin to believe it. Has anyone ever told you that you weren't capable, that you didn't deserve something you deeply wanted? That lie is unfair, and it settles into the quietest place in our hearts. Josephine lived with that lie for years, in a place that should have protected her, and even so, not for a single moment did she allow that lie to become the final word about who she was. Like us, she had her places of refuge, the creek, her mother's ribbon, and above all, hope. She endured, she resisted, and she never allowed the harshness of everything to erase the most beautiful part of who she was. And destiny, which weaves more slowly than we would like, kept tying the threads together in its own time. If you've made it this far, perhaps you recognized yourself in some part of this story. Perhaps you too have felt invisible in a place that was supposed to be yours. Perhaps you too have held on to something small, a memory, a hope, a blue ribbon, just to have proof that good things exist as well. Don't let it go. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be chosen. And you deserve a love that doesn't need permission to exist. I will always be here with this story to remind you of that. And if this story warmed your heart, share it with someone who also needs to hear it today. And if you're not yet part of our family here on the Boundless Ranch Love channel, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. A big hug, and I'll see you next time.